welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to another session of Project Genesis Interfaith. Those of you who are with us on Zoom, we will mute you so that there's no confusion. We'd also invite all of you to join us on our website, project-genesis.org. Our website contains many good things and projects that are going on and messages from Father Roy, Rabbi Gotti, and myself. We are also in the process of editing these particular programs, and once we finish editing them, they will be up for your viewing pleasure, so you can catch up with what we've been up to. Just to give you a little preview, we started this, calling this group of talks the Jewish Christian Inquiry into the New Testament. And we spent years talking about the Gospels and the book of Revelation. And this year we decided to move on to talking about Vatican Council II and interfaith friendships. And our discussions have been centering around the documents Nostra Aetate, which is the document concerning non-Christian religions, and the document on ecumenism. And of course, ecumenism is the movement towards Christian unity. And in the process, we have decided that in trying to understand interfaith friendships, we must get to know our dialogue partners. We must get to know about them, their faith traditions, so that we can more honestly dialogue. So as part of the program, we spent the first couple of sessions talking about Jewish-Catholic relations. And we decided, in terms of entering into the spirit of ecumenism, to open it up to our Christian brothers and sisters and get to know them a little bit better. So what we have done is we have invited Reverend George Summers to introduce us to the Protestant Reformation. Let me tell you a little bit about George. He's a member of the Greenport Ecumenical Ministries out here on Long Island. George has degrees from CCNY, Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and from Stony Brook. He's been involved in a lot of ecumenical and interfaith dialogues, one of which he was the chair of the Metropolitan New York Synod Ecumenical Dialogue with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York, and is currently involved with the Episcopal Diocese of New York and Long Island. He's the treasurer and chairperson of the Long Island Council of Churches, and since 1970, he's been the pastor of Advent Lutheran Church here in Mattituck. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce George. I've heard him speak, and the talk will be enlightening, I think, especially to many who do not or are not familiar with the Protestant Reformation. But before I let George talk, I want to say hello to Rabbi Gotti. And Gotti, do you have any introductory comments before we start?
No, I'm excited for this session because I feel like we've all gone through reformations, one way or another. Every major religion, every major organization maybe needs to go through reformations. And I know I'm a product of a Jewish Reformation, the Rabbinic Judaism. So I'm excited to hear about this and compare notes.
In fact, that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Okay, so without further ado, introduce you to Reverend George Summers.
Good to see everybody. Well, good to see you, or think about all the people out there in television
I
land.
think you should a little
Am I-
closer to the mic.
Okay.
Yep.
There we go. I think what you ended up speaking about was that something that I wanted to say. As soon as you said, "Would I talk about the Reformation?" What I really wanted to do is talk about the whole series of reformations. Every organization, the church, even our country goes through reformations. Every 4 years we get a president and things change. Sometimes it goes 8 years, but there's always some change coming in. And that's happened in the church too. To go back even before the so-called the Reformation started technically in 1517 with Martin Luther, but it really, the first Reformation was in 1084 when the Pope excommunicated the bishops of the Orthodox Church, everything on the east, and we get the separation of Western Roman Catholic understanding and Orthodox understanding, which is usually today in various national forms, the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox we think of now. And some of the Ukrainians are not Orthodox, they're Romans, so there's all sorts of mixtures and combinations. But when people get mad at one another, they say goodbye. And then after a while, they begin to think, well, maybe we said that too hastily. So there are always efforts to mend the fences. You said you talked about Vatican II. One of the things that Vatican II required each Roman Catholic diocese to do was to be involved in ecumenical dialogue. And when that happened, that's when I started to be asked by our bishop to represent the Lutherans in various local dialogues, some of which I'm still on. But the Lutheran Reformation is preceded by various failed reformations, or not so failed, however you want to look at it. I'm just going to refer to my notes to get the exact days. A man named John Wycliffe, who was an Englishman from 1328 to 1384, long before Luther, and he got into trouble for translating the Bible. Now, in that time, the English church was still Roman Catholic. Henry hadn't come along and separated. So he was not excommunicated, not hanged at the stake or any of those things, but he was sent to be a chaplain to a girls' school in Scotland, which is sort of like banishment. But the Wycliffe Bible translation is one of the better Bible translations into English, and it marked one of the first things about the Reformation people wanted. They wanted to be able to read the scriptures themselves. They didn't want to have to read it in Latin. It was not even written in Latin. It was written in Hebrew and Greek. And so they wanted to read it in the original languages. After Wycliffe comes a man who didn't fare so well, Jan Hus, a Czech man from 1369 to 1416. He was executed the year before Luther started his Reformation. He was speaking for the Czech people, was also involved in Czech nationalism. At this time, we're going to find it with Luther as well, nationalism was involved. People didn't want to go to Rome every time they needed something or want to change things. They wanted to stay in their own country. Henry VIII, of course, wanted everything done out of England. Luther took advantage of German nationalism, and Hus took advantage of Czech nationalism. But unfortunately, he did not survive that. He was executed, and there's still some, what they call Hussites, are still around in parts of Czechoslovakia. Luther comes along after that in 1484 and dies in 1546. But the year to remember for Luther is 1517, and he champions a lot of the issues that the others had too. One was translating the Bible into whatever the vernacular was. In his case, it was German. In Wycliffe's case, it was English. In Huss's case, it was Czech. All of these people start on that same path. But Luther also wanted to open up the concept of grace, God's love, God's forgiveness, God choosing people and helping them and supporting them and being with them. This is not a policy that is foreign. It begins, its roots are traced way back to God choosing Abraham and Sarah, who were nothing. They were old people with no children and no land. And God chose them, not because they were wealthy, not because they were generals and military, not because they had a power and influence, particularly because they were nobody, so that God could shine through them. And he chose to give them land and children, one child, Isaac. So that's great. To Luther, that would be grace. But Luther saw grace all through the New Testament. He was a monk, an Augustinian monk, so he knew the system from the inside out. His history is very interesting, but we talk about that some other time, perhaps. But he just in studying and preparing his courses for teaching to the students in his monastery, on the book of Romans, which is one of Paul's letters, and on Paul's letter to the Galatians, he discovers the concept of grace again, which he felt had been hidden by the Roman Catholics because they had a system of merit and works and keeping rules and regulations. So, and one of the things that Jesus objected to in Judaism at the time is that concept of legalism. God will love you if you do this, if you do that. And Luther says, no, God just loves you, plain. For those who are Roman Catholic, I don't know. You probably had the same lesson last week, the gospel of the prodigal son. And that was a fine illustration of grace. The father in that story loves the errant son, and he loves the other son who's arrogant and doesn't want to come to the party given for the runaway son. And we never find out whether he came to the party, but grace is there powerfully. And so that's one of the main theological things that Luther wants to understand, and it's translated into the term salvation by grace through faith. The faith we have is not something we have, it's something given to us, and God gives us the faith to believe and to trust himself, to trust God. Maybe it's, I don't know if that's a good introduction, but...
So if you had to ask the one question that we can ask in half an hour, what was the reason? I know it's a series of reformations, a series of reasons, but what would be the moment that you would say caused Martin Luther or the whole organization behind him to make that day the date?
Well, the historians put the time at October 31st, 1517, the famous story of the 95 Theses that were attached to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, where Luther was a teacher and in the monastery there. He wanted a debate on the topic of indulgences. Now, that was the issue that broke the camel's back. That was the issue that started him. It turns out it never became a major issue in the principles of the Reformation. Other things took over, but it's what started it out. And just as in America, the Boston Tea Party was all about the taxes of the tea, and after a while, it was not about that at all. They had gone on to all sorts of issues. And so...
It was about independence.
Yeah, yes.
So maybe in this case also the word would be independence, because also giving people the independence to read the text directly.
Right.
Also.
Well, the issue of the indulgences were that in the Roman Catholic system of that time, and very little of it remains in the Roman Catholic Church today, but it was very powerful in those days. You could buy what were called indulgences. In fact, you you were cajoled and you were threatened almost that if you didn't buy these things for your relatives, these were for deceased relatives, to get them out of purgatory. And if you paid a certain amount of money, which went to the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. They needed to raise, it was a fundraising effort. If you didn't pay your ticket, it's very much like in political parties. If you didn't contribute to the certain political party, you couldn't keep your political job. And so they had to contribute to these indulgences, and the indulgences got these people into heaven. And Luther said, no way can this happen. Jesus' death on the cross is what gets us into heaven. God's love and God's grace is what gets us into heaven. And we need to appreciate that. And as time went on, there were more and more things that came up. The translation of the scripture so that they could read it themselves. The translation of the words of the Mass so that they could understand when they went to Mass what was being said and what was going on. Luther didn't mind having a few of the incidental liturgical portions of the Mass still done in Latin, but the sermon and the reading of the scripture had to be in the language of the people. In that case, it was German.
Yeah. So that's another reason maybe when we look at the independent reasons they had. What about the nationalism aspect?
Well, that was a very important aspect because in the Principality of Saxony, the prince at the time was a man called Frederick the Wise, who supported Luther because he was one of his guys. Frederick the Wise never became a Lutheran. He was a Roman Catholic all his life. The word on the street was that Luther never even met him. But he supported Luther, and he said if he's going to get a trial, it's not going to be in Rome, it's going to be right here. There was several hearings given to Luther, and all sorts of efforts were made to save him. And unlike Huss, Luther was never executed, and unlike Wycliffe, he wasn't sent to Scotland to exile. He voluntarily went to a place called the Wartburg, which is a castle right in the middle of Germany, where he stayed for a while and hung low while things blew over. Also, politically, there was a new emperor coming, and there was a plying between the various princes in Germany and in Italy and in France to get their power and to fight the Pope. So it was a time of a rising change and all the things that played into it. Luther, 1517, of course, 1492 were the voyages of Columbus, and people were seeing beyond just little Europe, and they were seeing beyond just their own understanding of the universe, with the sun in the middle, not the earth in the middle, and the earth is round, not flat. And so all their expectations and all their things, which came indirectly at least, if not directly, from the church. The church supported all those things and hung on to them long after everybody didn't believe it anymore. And so also one of the things that worked so well to Luther's case was Gutenberg had developed the concept of movable type, printing as we know it today. Instead of carving everything in a piece of wood and then printing it, you had all little letters, and you could set those letters up, and then you could unset them and reuse them again. So all of Luther's stuff, his books and speeches, and he was good at writing short tracts that the people could read, the people who could read them. And there were a growing number of people who could read, business people and lawyers and people educated, they could read. And so they would read all of these, and they made up their own mind, and they didn't listen to the church anymore.
Yeah. It was, I think the term Reformation didn't really come into play for another 12 years after 1517. But it is, to me, it's very interesting, too, as to look at the different, what we would call Protestant churches or groups that grew out of the Reformation. In 1534, I believe, Henry VIII had his run-in with the Pope, and therefore the trouble with the church Church of England and Rome, but could you say something about some of the groups, denominations that grew out of the Reformation?
Well, you mentioned Henry VIII. Henry VIII is a sort of a strange case because it's more of his own personal desire to have a divorce, but also it's the desire of England to be separate from Europe and to preserve their separateness and to decide right in England what's going to happen. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury is the one who granted him his divorce, and it wasn't the Pope who did that. But also, shortly after Luther, starts a man named Zwingli, and then taken over by Calvin, John Calvin, who is the father of modern-day Reformed churches. And that's really where the term Reformation is used, with the Reformed community, which would today be the Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed. Anybody with Reformed in their title comes from Calvin. And Calvin and Luther disagreed, because once it was okay to disagree with Rome, you could also disagree with the reformer down the street who wants to start his own church too. Luther was also concerned that there were what he called Schwärmerei. They're like ants swarming around. Everybody and his uncle was coming out with his own religion and his own understanding. And there were fights over this. A lot of people misunderstood what Luther was talking about, and they just said, "Oh, well, we can believe anything we want. We can do anything we want, and you're saved by grace. You can be as bad as you want because God's going to save you in the end." And so Luther had to put his foot down on a number of cases. It turns out, in the end, after this period of 100 years or so, where various groups are forming, and there's even some that form much later on. The Methodists, which is quite a significant number of people in America, all came out of the Church of England because they were not quite happy with Henry didn't go far enough. And so they reformed the Reformed, and they wanted a little more life and a little more spirit in their religious work. And so John Wesley and Charles Wesley, his brother, formed little what they called conventicles. They were Episcopal priests, which they became known as eventually after Henry started this, and they had their own little meetings on Sunday afternoons because they weren't happy with what went on Sunday mornings, and eventually they left on their own. But all these reforms, Luther and, for example, and Calvin, there was times when people were saying, "Hey, why don't you get together with Calvin? You could really do much better in all these battles we're fighting with Roman Catholic people." And it wasn't the Roman Catholic Church, it was the princes. What happened in Germany was that each prince of each area would choose what religion his people would be. It wasn't free for anybody to do it. It was Frederick the Wise would say, "Well, we're going to be Lutheran." He remained Catholic himself, but his people are officially Lutheran, and some other community would be officially Roman Catholic. To this day, in Germany, most of the Lutherans are in the northern area of Germany, and in the southern area is still Roman Catholic. They said, "Well, let's get Calvin in on this, and we can get," because he centered down in Geneva and in Switzerland and in France. The Huguenots are descendants from Calvin as well. They're one of the Reformed communities. But Luther and Calvin, they never met, but they were really mad at one another over the concept of what happens in Holy Communion. This is another principle that Luther came up with eventually. The Roman Catholics said that the bread and the wine actually changed to the body and blood of the Lord. Luther said, they said it was by this concept of transubstantiation, where the substance is changed, but the accidents, this is all Greek philosophical terms from Aristotle, the accidents, which are the breadness and the wineness, they don't change. It's only the substance that changes. But the people whether they believed it or whether they understood it or not. Luther said he didn't mind that it was really the body and blood of Christ, but nothing changes this way. They can't divide the substance. He objected to the requiring people to believe this esoteric doctrine. And so he said, Christ is truly present in, with, and under the bread and the wine. And there were some people, Calvin, for example, said, no, Christ is not in there. In Calvin, Christ is still up in heaven. Christ has ascended to heaven, and he's not out of heaven. He doesn't come down there. We are brought up to him. Well, as we look back on this 500 years later, so what's the difference? It's not very much. But to Luther and Calvin, it was very much. There's an ecumenical agreement between Lutherans and Episcopalians, and there's an ecumenical agreement between Lutherans and Calvinists that sort of makes a common ground for all of these things today. And when we finally announced the common statement on justification, for example, justification by grace through faith, most of us said, well, now that we've agreed on this thing from 1517, who cares? Does the average Joe on the street think about how am I justified with God? The term justification alone never meant much. It started to mean a little bit more when they invented computers, because on the top of your printing screen, you can decide whether the type that you're typing is justified left, justified center, or justified right, or justified both ends.
So it seems to me like what Martin Luther did is really, or the Reformation as a result of what he did, when we take nationalism into it, when we take the infallibility of the Pope that he was suggesting, it may be what flipped here was a much wider paradigm, because what really happened before the Reformation, the church, as you were saying, was over the kings.
Yeah.
And it sent or financed the kings when they were going on their pursuits. Mm-hmm. But maybe this is exactly what changed, is that the man doesn't want to be only subjugated to the church.
Right.
They want independence.
Particularly
in
when the
many
church
ways.
was foreign, and the whole concept of being foreign was getting developed by the Renaissance and by all the other people who were coming up with, the local people coming up with ideas and doing things. People began to be educated. The monasteries were providing schools. So the whole milieu, the whole times were changing. Yeah. As Dylan used to say, the times they are changing. And that was what was Luther.
Yeah, just keep the microphone.
I don't think Luther intentionally capitalized on that, but it just happened. It worked. It was all the right combination of things that comes together. It's like baking a cake. You have to put all the ingredients in, and it finally happened. It didn't happen, unfortunately, with poor John Huss and Wycliffe, but it has started to happen in 1517. And it started a whole understanding of things. You couldn't have the concept of America and democracy if you didn't have Luther and breaking away from Rome and having the people choose what's going on and the people knowing what's going on. The people have to know this. Luther insisted on training children into the faith, that they know what the faith is all about. He writes this small catechism so that the father of the household would sit down and have the children memorize it. Of course, memorizing is not today's great thing, but in those days, that was how you learned things. And so he had this catechism to help the fathers, who themselves didn't know what it was that they were teaching. So they had this book that they could go over with their children. And it's very much like when people came to America, they were encouraged to have public schools, so that in the school they would learn all the things about our country, enough to vote intelligently for the right people.
It also seems to me that as we bring it closer, I, as a Roman Catholic, have always believed that had there not been this split, Luther would be considered one of the greatest reformers of the church. But it also shows, excuse me, how important dialogue has become. You know, and it still happens that you have people on both sides, and all of a sudden the humility is gone and arrogance takes over, so they move further and further apart, they demonize the other, and they don't talk. And here we have something that happened in the 16th century, which just festered and festered and festered. And it's really only now in the 20th century where we have begun to talk to one another.
It's very important that the Roman Catholics Vatican Council in 1960s started this emphasis. Ecumenism itself starts back in 1900 with various world councils of churches, but dialogue was never the emphasis. And the emphasis there was more getting the organizations together. But in the 60s with Vatican Council, people started to talk to one another. I remember as a child, we walked by the Roman Catholic Church, and it was sort of mysterious. If the door was open, you could peek in, but you didn't know what went on in there. And then in the 60s, we were encouraged to have services together. When I first came to Mattituck in 1970, I had suggested in several of the other churches, the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church, that we have some joint services for Lent, let's say, that we could have a service every week in each other's churches. You're just finishing that here in Greenport, but this, and I said, but you can't do this without having the Roman Catholics. Oh no, we don't know what to say. So I went to talk to a young priest there whose funeral I just attended, John Fitzgerald, who was the assistant there, the curate, and oh yeah, let's do that. So we had these services, and in the Lutheran Church we said the Lord's Prayer, and then because each group would put their own service together that sounds like the one they did on Sunday morning. And Roman Catholic people came up to me, I never knew you Protestants used the Lord's Prayer. How were they supposed to know? They were never out to go to a Protestant church, and vice versa. It just continued. I mean, every week people would be amazed, they would be jaw-dropping that what goes on. Even Lutherans didn't quite know what was going on in the Presbyterian Church because they'd never been there. It's like a separation that has now come down. Yeah. They all.
And that's what we're trying to do here.
Yes.
And to get all the denominations come through and explain their differences. But of course, it started with the conversation between Judaism and Christianity in general.
Right.
You know,
right.
For me, it's interesting because the Reformation, from my own Jewish experience, you know, I don't have a problem with it that much because we've had debates so many times, you know, over the years, big debates and big reformations like this. You know, for us, the destruction of the temple was, I think, kind of put us on the road of, you know, the wandering Jew, that you go and you wander in the world and you keep pursuing something. So these reformations for us is almost ongoing. But I would say, I feel like what the Reformation did for Catholicism, it's really bringing the Protestant churches almost back to Judaism in some ways. You know, well, the Catholic Church made a point to distinguish itself from its Jewish roots for many years.
Right.
In some ways, you went back.
One of the first, I mean, the history of the church in general is a series of reformations, and we just happen to label the one of 1517 of Luther as being sort of stand out. But the rest of them were still there. In fact, the Catholic Church, the Christian church in the early first century, the first thing they had to do was distinguish, are we a group of Jews or are we a separate group?
Right. So same thing with the Reformation. They hadn't decided they're still Catholic reformers or there's something else.
And Henry, for example, tried to say, well, I'm in charge here, but we can keep the same doctrines. And the people that were originally in charge said, no, you can't. You can't have our doctrines. And so they had big fights over these things.
It's the Brexit of 600 years ago.
Right.
And Henry himself died believing that he was still a Roman Catholic.
Oh, yes. He just didn't want to have to go to the Pope to get divorces.
Right.
So how long would you say the Reformation really, it took it to take place? So, like, there's a joke saying about the historian. What are the implications of the French Revolution? And they say it's too soon to know.
Yeah. Well, with Lutherans, for example, in the parts of the world, in Germany, in northern Germany, in Sweden, in Denmark, and Norway, which all were Lutheran countries, because the king was Lutheran, or the prince in your area was Lutheran. So you were told you will be Lutheran here. In fact, the Lutheran churches were funded by tax money. It's still, in this day, the tax supports the Lutheran churches in those countries, just as it supports the Church of England in England. And so when the Lutherans came to America, they were saying, well, we have to go and raise our own money? What's this here? What do we got to? They couldn't understand this, that they were not part of a state, federal funded group of people here. And they figured we get more Lutherans in here, we'll run. We'll tell everybody you got to be Lutheran now because there are more Lutherans than there are others here. But it didn't work that way in America, and they had to rediscover this. In early Protestant groups, including Lutherans, because the early Americans were not just English, there was a large number of German immigrants in that mix, and Scotch and Irish. Scots particularly were not Roman Catholic. And so they made their own worship services, and they did everything, and they closed the doors, in a sense, to everybody else who came in. That when the Irish immigrated and the Italians immigrated, there's still to this day, there are Irish Catholic churches and Italian Catholic churches when they first came to America. They didn't want to be together with the Irish. And so, but one of the things we did in the Protestant churches, in the Lutheran church, I know, they find out, well, what do we want to do? Do we want to stand for the Lord's Prayer or do we want to sit? Well, what do the Catholics do? They sit. Well, we'll stand then. Everything was done just the opposite, just to because they had to be different. It's changed now with the Vatican II, which is in a sense the Second Reformation. It became, let's get to know one another, and that's what you're doing here, talking about it, and find out that the differences are exaggerated, like the arguments between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Nobody knows anymore why we don't like them, but we don't. And so we have to find out what do we really believe? What's really going on in the Roman Catholic Church? And why are we Lutherans say we're so different? We're not different.
So another thing that, to say that we're not that different is, and you alluded to it when, the idea of grace, really, Martin Luther wanted to bring it to the surface.
Yeah.
It's not all about law.
Right.
So we have this discussion about law versus love.
Right.
Are you worshiping God out of fear, out of law, out of love? What is it about? So of course the combination of both has to be there.
Right.
So, but that is something that people are misinformed that actually the idea of grace did come from the Hebrew scripture.
Oh, yes.
That it's not that Christianity somehow came up with the idea of going beyond your merits.
For the longest time, Protestant churches, particularly Lutheran churches, when they read their scripture, as they did every Sunday, they did not read from the Old Testament. Well, that's gone. That's old. It's bad. And anyway, if we read it takes too long. So don't read that. Cut out the... Well, today, you can't get by without an Old Testament lesson. And we get as much grace, and we get what we need out of the Old Testament.
Yeah, these are the roots.
Yeah, yeah.
I think also, and correct me if I'm wrong, they came about even in these discussions over grace and justification. At root, there seemed to be an understanding or a difference in understanding of human nature between Roman Catholics and Protestants. That the human nature, on the one hand, was corrupt, and on the other hand, it was not corrupt. It was just weakened, and that played into the idea of justification by grace also.
Right. Well, during before all of this time, during the scholastic period and during the Middle Ages, a very complicated system of what I would liken to a giant God as a giant bookkeeper in the sky. And every time you do something good, that life could be quantified as the good deeds and bad deeds. And so you did a good deed, you did a bad deed, you did this, you did that. And at the end, there's a balance sheet, and well, you're a little short. You can't go to heaven right now. And they I don't know how they justify it today, but they've never been able to explain it to us Lutherans in dialogues as to why the concept of purgatory came up. That yes, God is going to take you to heaven. I think it mainly got easily misunderstood. God is going to take you to heaven, but heaven can't have dirty people there. So you've got to be cleaned up first. This is the best explanation I've heard from a Roman Catholic, was that they needed a place to clean you up. You're going to go to heaven, sure, but you've got to be cleaned up. You've got to pay the penalty for your sins. Like a person has to be in jail for a crime, but then when you're done, you're done.
So the real issue here was that you had to buy grace.
Well,
And
it
that's
ended
almost-
up that
it's
it ended up
antithetical.
that you had to buy it with time spent in purgatory. But in the end, the church thought, well, we got to raise money and let's sell. They had this thing they called the treasury of merit. That were, if you died, most people died with a negative balance on their balance sheet. But then there were the saints. There were the good people, the really good people, who died with a positive balance on their. So they went up to heaven. They didn't have to go to purgatory. They didn't have to be cleaned up. But their treasury, all these extra good deeds were laying around there. And the church had the power to transfer them to you or you. And of course, when eventually they figured out for a fee, I don't blame them for thinking that, but they did. It's all makes sense as you see it going along. But when you stop and you look at here to there, it doesn't make sense anymore. You know, it's like you're decorating a house. You buy a house, and then you change this, and you change that, and you add on a porch, and you change the windows, and you paint it green. And after a while, is that the same house you bought 50 years ago? It had just gotten away with itself.
I think one of the positive elements of Vatican II was the rising, if you will, of the concept of historical consciousness. That so much of the doctrines and the customs and even truth itself were all historically conditioned. And therefore, it puts a whole different light on a lot of these debates. For example, we Catholics find it almost easily to refer to this person or this group as heretics. Well, you know, in terms of a historical consciousness, the heretics that we call heretics now were doing nothing more than questioning from a historical perspective, certain theological questions. And like everything else, the winners get to make the decisions. And so I think, too, what has so much influenced dialogue and today is this idea of dealing with the historical moment and understanding that so much of what we have fought over was so historically conditioned that it takes us back and we say, well, now let's take a look at what brought this about, what caused it, and it's opened up a whole different world in understanding theology, scripture, all of the sacred sciences.
Yeah, I have a general question about this. You know, it's like saying, it's almost theological, when people say, you know, Adam and Eve somehow had to sin or had to leave the Garden of Eden in order to become who they are and to, you know, flourish and multiply. Is it the same argument in the church or the synagogue that these reformations would happen one way or another, and there was no way for the Catholic Church to reform itself that much from within to accommodate what was coming?
Well, I may not be answering your question, but you opened up in my mind one of the things that we have when in discarding the Old Testament, which the church did for the longest while. I constantly use the story of Adam and Eve and the tree and the fruit and the fall to understand the fall. I think as Christians, we look to our Jewish ancestors and their faith, that somehow or other they're barely out of the caveman state, say at 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and they look around at the world and they see two things. This is what I get out of the beginning of Genesis. They see a loving God who's with them, but they also see that they live in a fallen world. And then they have to say, well, how do we come upon that? Did this loving God purposely put us in a fallen world? No. We fell of our own accord. And that's, I think, to me, the story of the garden and all. It's a tradition, it's a story, you have to interpret it. But we live in a fallen world, and the church exists in a fallen world. And the kinds of selfishness and greed on the parts of some of the popes along the way, and the corruption in the clergy, which lingers today in all denominations. We're human, and we live in a fallen world, and you can't forget it. And God's not going to take you out of it, but God's going to go there. The story of the Adam and Eve is that God goes with them into that world that they created by falling from whatever. I don't know if that fits.
Like Israel going into exile, and God goes with them.
And God rescues them from there and puts them returns them to the promised land. What would we bring out from all the historical periods? What would we bring out to bring the Christians together? And the latest understandings that we've been discussing in ecumenical circles is we're not seeking organic unity. We don't have to be all one physical church with one leader sitting somewhere with a big desk and a crown or something. We need to simply understand one another. We don't all have to be Americans. Some of us could be Canadians and Ukrainians and French and German. It's okay as long as we live in peace with one another and understand and help one another. So the idea of the latest understanding is try to distill what is at the core of our faith. What are the main teachings? A couple of years ago, the World Council of Churches started to develop Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, they called it. It was a little booklet that they put out. We have to be able to accept each other's baptism, each other's communion, Eucharist. And not that we have to have it or think of it. We have to accept that if you're a Roman Catholic, you should accept that when a Lutheran takes communion, it is in fact what the Lutheran thinks it is. It's the body and blood of Christ.
I would just add to that one thing, because the Reformation in the Jewish world a lot of times is a matter of how literal do you take God's revelation.
Right.
And I think here too, you have the same issue because
Right.
it's how literal are you seeing the Eucharist?
Right, right, right. Can we see things in a broader aspect, in a broader way? Can we accept each other's ministry? And this is what we started to do. I mean, this man whose funeral I just went to, Father John Fitzgerald in Mattituck, we decided that we cared enough about each other's understandings that we accepted his ministry. I accepted that he was being a good priest to his people, and he accepted that I was being a good priest to my people. And we shouldn't go around saying, "Oh, he's evil, he's bad, he's not the right one. You can't talk to him. He's not Lutheran. He's Roman Catholic." And in fact, I asked this man to preach at my installation. Of course, a lot of the Lutherans didn't like that, but why not? But I think that's we have to find some of the basics of it. I think the UN tries to do that with all the different nations. It doesn't work much better than the League of Nations did. To see that we all have certain interests, and we need to protect each other's interests, but we need to also share those interests.
I can give another example from the holiday we just had, Purim, and the book of Esther that we read in. Haman, who was Ahasuerus's right hand, he defines to him who the Jewish people are. And he's saying it's the same people, only they're in different countries. And that was the Persian Empire that ruled over 127 countries. So it's like the Roman Empire that you really didn't have where to run.
Right.
Right. So, but the idea is that our enemies a lot of times define who we are.
Right.
So he, just like Pharaoh in Egypt, recognized, oh, these people here, they're different in what they do, but they're one nation.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So in a sense, if it makes it easier for you, when I look at the Christian world, you all look Christian to me. You're all Christian. You believe in the incarnation of Jesus. For me, that's really, of the divinity of Jesus. That, to me, is the threshold. But it's interesting that you, even yourself, are still debating it within yourself.
Well, we're working on that, but that's the answer to a lot of our problems. We're working on it. But I think the opposite is also important, is that we see each other all over the world, but we also have to stop hating and working against one another. Things like the Holocaust that are just so awful, to think that Christians or people who call themselves Christians took part in that, and all sorts of other modern versions of that. We have to stop hating one another. We have to start understanding one another more. And this is going to be, I think, until the world comes to an end, this is going to be the big challenge. We have to work on that, and that's why we work to have services together, and to be invited to your Seder, your model Seder.
Of course.
And I think we have to also begin to see the world as it is. One of the key statements of Pope Francis is that reality is more important than ideas. And we have become so obsessed with ideologies today that people with different ideologies become demonized. And we have forgotten how to see reality through the eyes of believing people. And if we call ourselves Christian, then the filter through which we see the world and understand the world has got to be our faith in Jesus Christ. And until we start to see the world, first of all, and all of these religions in a universal context, and I think this was one of the great advantages of having elected Francis from the Southern Hemisphere. One of the things Francis has begun to do is to make us aware that, for example, the Catholic Church is not a Western European church. He sees, and I believe in a real sense, Francis is a mystic because he sees a whole picture, right? And until we begin to see that there is one people with many, many differences, inspired by the same Spirit and believing in the same God, those are the things that we have to begin to inculcate into the people. But in today's world, where political ideologies have taken over, that's a tough nut to crack.
Well, to speak well of Pope Francis, for example, his whole attitude towards homosexuality, it's still against Roman Catholic principles, but that doesn't mean that we need to hate those people. How do we accept people where we we want to be different? We want to accept them in their differences. Not just to accept people's differences, but accept the people in spite of or in their differences.
I want to thank you, George, for coming and really, for me, every time I hear a conversation like this with someone who spent a lot of time on it, you can always ask the question and in half an hour, understand the core of this. And I learned again that as much as we want to attribute these breakoffs or reformations to, strictly religious realm, we can never do that. Yeah. There's always these extra layers in it, political a lot of times, like even the death of Jesus was a lot of it political. So this is something that we have to learn maybe for the future, like you said, when someone is showing signs of difference, let not cast them out right away. Right. Give them a chance.
Yeah, and we hope that you who are present and you who are on Zoom understand now what we are trying to foster in our conversations here. We have to get to know our partners in dialogue and in charity, and not to come to judgment, but to really listen. In listening, we open up. I find sometimes we use the word tolerance in a way that I dislike, because to me, being tolerant means I don't have to understand you, I'll just put up with you. And I think we have gone beyond that. And George, thank you so much for enlightening us and helping us in our own dialogue here.
It's been my privilege.
Thank you very much. Thank you.